Okay, where we left off last week with our last video, we were working on seaming together these different parts of the head. And the head had a lot of different components, a beetle top, a mouth bottom. I ended up using puppy eyes and kind of a lizard top jaw. And it's got a bird with kind of a thick neck as a background going into shoulders. Now, I haven't adjusted the individual color balance of these, but I've done a lot with the edges. And then there's little things I can do to just help them all kind of work together, which I'll show you. We've gone over clone stamp and a lot of internal edges, but the last step to getting our head ready or an important step is to adjust the color balances and what we call the direct adjustments. So I'm going to use my move tool. I'm going to have auto select layer turned on so I can just click on the layer like the beetle shell and it will go right to that so I can affect that layer. The blue mohawk's kind of funny. I might like that blue mohawk so much that I might do something with it later. I just have to remember. Okay, so now the beetle's pretty nicely cut out. There's some hard edges. There's some soft transition edges. You see the difference, right? So where it's kind of a hard edge here is where it's overlapping with things that could be hard edges. I could soften that still a little bit. But then where it gets into overlapping the hair, this soft texture, that's where I used a soft edged eraser. So that when it covers it up, it's kind of blending it a little bit more. And then I burned underneath it a little bit, but now just the full direct adjustments are going to be really helpful. So first thing, image, adjustment, levels. It's always these three. Play with the mid-tone slider. Do I want it to go brighter or do I want it to go darker overall? And then if needed, I could intensify the shadows. Maybe just a little bit, but maybe limit them somewhat. Like that. I could intensify the highlights, but I don't think I want to do that in this case. Once you're happy with the lights and darks, and it helps to squint, because squinting, it heightens the rods in our eyes, which see lights and darks, like gray values, and dims the cones, which see color, so that we can see if those highlights and shadows are what we want. Now we can go to the color adjusting, which shouldn't change our lights and darks too much, though sometimes color temperatures have a slightly different value. Like blue and yellow, you can see how that brightens everything up quite a bit versus blue, just because blue is a darker spectrum color than yellow is. But I'm going to take the midtones, that's where you're always safe, and I'm going to push them back and forth. I'm going to push them a little bit more towards the blue and towards the red, because that's going to help it match some of these other elements. I don't think I need to go towards the green or the magenta, but pushing it either way kind of shows you what to lean on. Then I might go to highlights. I'm going to warm up the highlights with a little bit of yellow. See how that looks? That looks good at the front there. And then I'm going to maybe bring some red into it just a little bit. That helps. And then I'm going to go to shadows, and I usually, if I warm up the highlights, I usually cool down the shadows somewhat. But we're talking very subtle shifts. Now if I go back in my history to before I did that, this was before levels, this was after levels, that helps. This is before color balance, this is after color balance, and you can see how that really helps everything to kind of sit together. So these direct adjustments seem like a simple thing, and in some ways kind of a pain to do, but they make a huge difference in the overall illusion and believability. Next, I'm going to go to the eyes. I'm going to do the same thing. Start with levels. Maybe I want to darken those eyes overall or lighten them up. I think I want them just a little darkened. I can even limit the highlights a tiny bit and increase the darkest dark so that those eyes really pop. All right. Color balance, image adjustment, color balance. This is my favorite one. Midtones. Do I want to go cooler? Do I want to go warmer? And it's just what kind of feels right with the thing I've already adjusted, which is the beetle. I think I can go a little bluer there in the midtones. And in the highlights a little bit warmer. And then in the shadows a little bit cooler. Now, this takes practice to kind of understand what the potential is. And the amateurish mistake is just to overdo it. So these are just gentle nudges towards what you want. And it will make the blending easier. It will make everything easier that comes. So next we have this very warm, very dry, kind of scaly upper mouth from this lizard. So I go to image adjustments. I'm going to start with levels. Push it brighter, which actually works better than I thought it would. Push it darker. So sometimes without pushing it both ways, you don't see which direction actually helps with your light source. Because our eyes are better at recognizing things than just immediately knowing what to do. But if I brighten that quite a bit, and I squint, it kind of makes all of this make a little bit more sense. I think everything else is good. So let me show you that difference. Sometimes levels can just make a big difference from that to that. And especially with all the light that's going into the mouth, especially the back of the head. I haven't adjusted the color yet, but now squinting with the light, I probably want to dim this still a little bit, but that's looking better. Okay, next, after levels, color balance, my favorite. This time I'm going to push the midtones away from being so warm. And you can see how that gives a little bit more color variation in these scales. You start to see the grays and the greens. And I can push it these different ways. Now, highlights, I'll warm it up again, just a little bit. Little jogs, and then shadows, cool it down. That will give it a little bit more dimension. But if I overdo it, I'm not going to like the result. Okay, now this one, the levels adjustment did this, then the color balance did that. Gave me a lot more definition. But this one does seem still different, just overall, in its coloring. So now I go to my third direct adjustment, which is hue saturation. And this is when you want big shifts in color, like just shifting the hue entirely. And of course, I don't want to do something crazy. What I want to do is just shift it a little bit, because this will move all of the pixels in the same direction. And then, do I want it just a little less saturated, which I think is the case here. That's the intensity of the color. And just every pixel here is a little bit more saturated than I need it to be. So instead of using the sponge tool, I can just do this overall with a direct adjustment of hue saturation. Might even try darkening it just overall just a little bit. And we can see if that makes a difference when I squint. And it helps a tiny bit. All right, so now, just working backwards on this head, the same thing we would do to adjust the layers of our landscape, foreground, middle ground, background. I'm just doing it on the aspects of my head. So now I've got the hippo mouth, and image adjustments, levels. I know I've dodged and burned it and gave more of a shadow inside, but this is overall. Does it work better if it's brighter? It actually surprisingly does work better if it's brighter to my eye than if it's darker. So I'm going to push that mid-tone slider a little bit brighter. I might limit the darkest shadow just a tiny bit. That tooth is just so different than everything else, but that's from the photo. So I might need to use some dodge on that tooth to soften up some of the contrast on that tusk. Now, sometimes we overdo it. I think I overdid it. I brightened it a little too much, so I can go back in my history or just do Command-Z, image adjustment. I know I want to brighten it, but maybe not that much. And if you're unsure, you can always make a duplicate of the layer and then adjust it and then blend that into the existing one. So you can kind of see all the options with opacity. Next, hue saturation, color balance. The subtle color shift. Should it go cooler? It looks like it needs to go cooler in the midtones. Highlights a little bit warmer. So it still looks like a fleshy inside of a mouth. And the yellow on the tusks. And then the shadows a little bit cooler. But not very much. So that's very subtle color shift, but that helps bring that definition forward. And then I've got my background. And one thing I want to do with the background is bring up that mohawk. I think that might be fun to have on the top. So what I'm going to do is internally composite that mohawk right there. Bring my selection down. Or is that from a different layer? I was thinking it was from the bird layer. It is. Okay. So I'm going to duplicate that. Command-J, internal composite, and then move it up. And then when I have my other elements on, I can actually include that into my image. But notice this might need different coloring than the rest of it. So image adjustment, levels. I want this to go maybe a little bit darker. And you know what? Before I do that, I'm just going to cut it out quick with my magic wand with contiguous at 32. And I'm going to say select and mask because this is a feather texture. And I'm going to feather it 1.4 pixels just so it softens that selection a little bit. So when I hit delete, it starts to soften that edge. So that's in Photoshop using the magic wand to select the empty space. You see the tiny little debris here. One way to get rid of that is to click select and mask and then feather just a little bit. I have it set to remember my settings, so about 1.4 pixels. You don't want to do it too much. And now you can see that the little debris that's out there has now been fully selected. So when I hit delete, it's fully deleted. And now when I select the empty space, there's no more debris. So slightly softer edge.
As you hit delete, it'll bring it in 1.4 pixels.
Yeah, so it's 1.4 pixels kind of radiating out from that selected edge with a soft edged eraser when I hit delete. So the more you hit delete, it will keep echoing a little bit. There'll be a limit. It probably won't go more than 10 pixels from where your selection is, but it will keep softening the more you hit delete. That's what's really nice about feather. If you don't have any feather on at all, you hit delete, it's always the same. It cuts right between the pixels. Okay, now, since I got rid of that gray when I use adjustments like levels, it's almost more like using the dodge and burn tool. Like I'll just see what it does to the feathers instead of that gray background behind it. Right, and I'm just going to leave it like that for now. And now I'm going to look at the layer underneath, and I'm going to play with levels. And in the same way, I might use my magic wand and select this background. I can hold down Shift and add to it, because this photo reference has a pretty distinct foreground and background, or figure and ground. And now while it's selected, I can hit select and mask. That activates this, say OK, my 1.4 pixel, and then delete. And that will give me a nice somewhat soft.